Coming up, continuing our coverage on the major changes to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, we learn about updates aiming to promote healing. Plus, a Native family is representing big in the South Dakota House. And on this week's IndigiPolitics, we have the latest on the presidential election and changes in U.S. Senate leadership. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines on the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Support for the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez comes from the Arizona PBS studios in Phoenix at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Arizona State University.
Amidawa Hopa. Thank you for joining us. I am Aaliyah Chavez. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA, was passed in 1990. It was created in part to speed up the return of Native ancestral remains that were dug up and placed in museums. But 34 years later, and Native leaders say too many ancestors are still being held in public institutions. This year, new rules governing NAGPRA went into effect. ICT's Mary Annette Pember reports on how Native people hope the new rules will bring their ancestors home, as well as some much-needed healing.
As of January, nearly 100,000 Indigenous remains were still being stored in public institutions across the country. Recently, I visited one such institution in Ohio.
I'm standing on the campus of the Ohio History Connection in Columbus, Ohio, the home of the country's largest public collection of Native American, Native Hawaiian, and Alaska Native human remains. The organization and associated museum is headquartered in the building behind me. But the more than 7,000 ancestors' remains held by the Ohio History Connection are stored in warehouses nearby. Concerned about theft and vandalism, Ohio History Connection leaders wouldn't allow ICT News to film these buildings. The remains have languished here for decades, but recent changes in the federal Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, have placed a 5-year deadline for museums and public institutions, such as the Ohio History Connection, to repatriate ancestors' remains to tribes.
Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Brian Newland.
My name is Brian Newland. I am a citizen of Bay Mills Indian community.
Says the new rules are long overdue and will help us, quote, heal from some of the more painful times in our past. Native leaders agree.
I think we all have heard these issues for generations. These are the things that our grandparents talked about, and this is something that we can do. You know, I think I don't know many families that would leave their relatives somewhere.
When we do things like repatriate the ancestral remains of Indigenous people, is we enhance everyone's humanity. We make it more possible for all of us to get along with one another.
Under the new NAGPRA regulations, Indigenous peoples will have the final word on the affiliation and disposition of the nearly 100,000 of their ancestors' remains held by institutions throughout the United States. In the past, organizations like the Ohio History Connection were the sole arbiters of which tribes, if any, had legitimate connections to these vast collections. By claiming that most remains were unaffiliated or unconnected to contemporary tribal groups, the institutions were legally allowed to keep ancestors in their collections to be used for research or other purposes. As of January 13, 2024, however, the supremacy of the Western worldview, at least in archaeological terms, has officially been put on notice.
Without a doubt, repatriation is more than a healing exercise. I think it really does something to change the power dynamics and also change public perception about who contemporary Native people are.
I don't know that America really understands how big this issue is.
Mary Annette Pember, ICT News.
That was the second of 3 segments we're running this week on the major changes to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Tomorrow, how some museums are making changes and helping to heal. To see the whole series, read more about these important issues, and watch extended interviews, visit us at ictnews.org. In Arizona, legislators approved a bill that regulates rehab programs from being targeted by Medicaid scams. Navajo State Senator Teresa Hitothli had unanimous support in the Senate last week for her bill that will prevent widespread fraud against those seeking help for addictions. The rehab facility scams have robbed hundreds of millions in Medicaid dollars, scamming hundreds of Native Americans. According to Hitothli, the bill will ensure checks and balances on an issue that's been affecting Native people since long before the pandemic. She anticipates a full House vote this week. In Washington, D.C., a ceremony was held to honor the establishment of a congressional charter to the National American Indian Veterans. The signing of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act granted the charter, which will allow Native veterans to have a voice in Washington. The group can now testify their concerns to Congress and talk directly to lawmakers about policy issues. South Dakota Senator Mike Rounds held the ceremony and hopes this larger platform will increase advocacy for more than 140,000 Native American veterans living in the U.S. In North Dakota, 200 wild horses could be removed from the Badlands of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. The National Park Service is drafting a park management plan for livestock that could limit or remove the horses. The horses have powerful allies at hand, including the governor of North Dakota, U.S. Senator John Hoeven, and now Congress. The Interior and Environmental Budget Bill, which was passed by Congress and signed by President Biden, mentions keeping the horses in place. The Park Service aims to make a decision by the end of April. This week on IndigiPolitics, we catch up on the presidential election, changes in Senate leadership, and a debrief on the Reservation Economic Summit. Here to talk more about this is ICT political correspondent Pauly Denetclaw and regular contributor Michael Stopp. He is the CEO of 7 Star Holdings.
Welcome back to the newscast, Michael.
Hi, Pauly. Thanks for having me. It's always great to be here.
So first, Nikki Haley has officially ended her presidential campaign, ensuring that there will be a Biden and Trump rematch coming in November. And so I'm curious, what does this mean for Indian country?
Well, I want to start by saying it does not necessarily ensure that. As we talked last time, the conventions still ultimately decide who the party nominees will be. And depending on what happens with both candidates, who are both elderly and one of them is under quite a bit of legal scrutiny, things could change between now and the times the delegates cast their vote at the convention. But under normal circumstances, we would know who the candidates are. I will say that both Trump and Biden have contributed to Indian country in different ways. I would like to remind some of our watchers that 2 of the most important Supreme Court decisions that came down involving Indian country in the last few years, from my home state of Oklahoma, the McGirt decision, basically reestablished or showed that the reservations were not disestablished at statehood of Oklahoma, which was a huge win for sovereignty in Indian country, especially some of these Oklahoma tribes. And that was penned by Justice Gorsuch, who was a Trump nominee. And then we saw the challenges to ICWA and basically trying to claim that Native Americans were a race and not a political class, which has been very difficult for Indian law and federal Indian policy going forward. And that was the political class was upheld by, and ICWA was upheld by the Supreme Court, and that was penned by another Trump nominee in Amy Coney Barrett. So there are good things from both sides. I think as we start talking about the political roadmap going forward, it is very important that tribal leaders and individual tribal members continue to engage with the federal government and remind them that we're still here and we play an important role in the states that we live in and in American policy and economy in general.
And how important is the Native vote this election?
So the Native vote has always been important. This year, it also happens to be the 100th anniversary of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which was signed in June of 1924. So this marks 100 years since American Indians were actually recognized as citizens of this country. So very important. When you look at the political roadmap and you look at the Electoral College, there are certain swing states that are super important to who actually occupies the White House. You see Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan as three of those. And then also, when you start talking about the makeup of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House, those states are also important. And in those states, you see a large Native population that can, in fact, make a huge difference in who wins and who doesn't. If you take Arizona, for example, there's a little over 400,000 tribal members within the state of Arizona. And the numbers in the 2016 presidential election, Trump won by 91,000 and Biden won by 10,000. So you see that tribal members can absolutely make an effect there. I will say the data is difficult to discern about what tribal members actually voted. If you look at a lot of the statistics, people look at the northern counties where you see the Navajo Reservation, the Hopi reservations, and how those counties voted, but they don't take into account urban Indians in the Phoenix area and how they voted. So it's difficult to know exactly how many natives voted in those elections. And if we leave it to CNN, we certainly don't know because they still consider us something else. So, but in the other states like Michigan and Wisconsin, we can see a little more of the effect. They're not quite the same effect that we have as in Arizona. Wisconsin, the vote difference in 2016 and 2020 was around 20,000 votes, and there's a little under 100,000 American Indians who live in Wisconsin, so absolutely they play a role there. In Michigan, the vote difference was quite a bit in 2020 with about 150,000 votes for President Biden, and there's a few less Native Americans who live in Michigan, but they still play an important role in that swing state.
And Mitch McConnell has said that he is stepping down from leadership position in the Senate. And so I'm curious, what are your thoughts about the possibility of Senator Markwayne Mullin?
Well, for those of you who don't know, I was the chief of staff for Markwayne for many years while he served in the House. When I first started with him, he was one of two Native Americans serving in Congress. He and Tom Cole, both from Oklahoma. Now we have more Native representative, and Senator Mullin is now the only Native serving in the Senate, and the first since Ben Nighthorse Campbell retired in 2005, I believe. The chances of him being leader are pretty slim, though personally I think that would be a great idea, especially for Indian country and especially for Oklahoma. But I think John Thune, who is a member from South Dakota and does have relationships with Indian country and understands Indian policy, I think is also going to be a very good pick as the Republican leader. At least he comes from a state that understands natives. He himself has run some good Native policy bills, and I think he's someone that Indian country can respect and look to for leadership.
And would Mullin make a good leader in the Senate for the GOP, considering his tense moment last November with Team O'Brien?
I think that we talk about that moment. My phone blew up that day that happened. Everybody asking me what I thought. So I started my career working for the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and then moved to the House. And I will tell you, there is a very different atmosphere in the Senate versus the House. The House is a little more confrontational, and the Senate is a lot more deliberative. And obviously, Senator Mullin behaving like that or asking questions like that and being so confrontational is unusual in the U.S. Senate. I will tell you that his constituents ate it up. They loved it. People in Oklahoma were just very excited to see him push back and to take a very strong policy stance. I think if it were up to the people of Oklahoma and his constituents who loved that, absolutely he would win leader. However, his constituents for leader are other U.S. senators, and he being a freshman and kind of taking a different tack in being a senator, I think it'd be difficult for him to win those votes needed. But I would love it personally.
And just very quickly here, you were at the Reservation Economic Summit. Can you tell us about why this yearly gathering is important?
Yeah, absolutely. We saw Native leaders from all over the country, not just tribal leaders, but leaders in business and leaders who are working in our federal government. I think it's very important for us to have these conferences like RES, where we get to hear from the federal leaders who sometimes aren't doing what we want them to do, and it's difficult to get them in a place where we can have conversations. Certainly, the opportunity to have these conversations in the hallways that maybe not as public and say, hey, we don't think you're doing this right, that's helpful, or to thank them for the things they are doing right. It's nice to have those leaders become accessible to us as they work on federal policy. Obviously, it's an opportunity for tribal leaders and tribes to engage in new economic development. That's why I was there. Our company works very hard to help with economic development in Indian country. And I think it's important that we look at new ideas and start to, gaming seems to be the top of a lot of people's minds when they think of economic development in Indian country, but there is so much more than that. And I think it's important that we diversify. Certainly, we saw challenges during the COVID time period that gaming was just difficult to maintain when everyone was at home. And so I think a lot of tribes saw the challenges to their revenue stream, and places like Res help us overcome those things and give new ideas. And obviously, we get to see old friends. Got to see you, Pauly. Got to see Mark, and got to see one of my favorite Democrats, Holly Cook McCarroll, who we talked for a few minutes, and were reminded that we should be doing a political podcast together to discuss the different ideas in Indian country. So I hope that comes to fruition someday.
Well, thank you, Mike, for being on the newscast again. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
We are all children born of water. It is where all life begins. Water embraces and protects us. We revere it in our homes. We need to live close to water. It nourishes and cleanses us. All living things know this. Sometimes water is gentle and floats in the air. Sometimes water is harsh and powerful. Sometimes it catches the sun's rays. Water changes with the seasons, alive and always moving, even when no one is looking. Water is patient. Water endures. Water brings clarity. Water purifies our thoughts. Water brings us together. Water is holy. Water helps us heal. Water is medicine.
Politics is a family affair in the South Dakota State Legislature. Shirley Snavy has this interview with Representative Tyler Tyon, whose mother, Tamara St. John, is also in the South Dakota House. Take a look.
I kind of convinced her to run. I told her I'd help her. I'll help you get signatures. I'll help you, pound signs and run your campaign for you if you run. And so she ran in 2017, got in 2018. Now she's in her third term. And so then when I was running, people were like, "Wow, that's so cool that you're following in your mom's footsteps." But they didn't realize that I was kind of the political beast behind the scenes. But she has been phenomenal at it, and it's been a lot of fun being able to serve with her at the same time too. And we get to be on one of the same committees together, and we don't always vote the same, but that's kind of fun. Just adds a good element to it all. I do care about tribal relations in South Dakota. Just being I tell people a dual citizen, a South Dakotan, an American, but also a proud tribal member from my home tribe. And so, and I always feel like we're on the right trajectory, but there's more that we can do. So that's been a big emphasis for me growing up, is that I want to find a way to learn the game and make change from within. Just because I felt like there wasn't enough tribal people involved at the state level or at the federal level too. And so that was a big emphasis for me. The other one I'll say is education. I tell people I'm uniquely qualified. Out of 105 legislators, I'm the youngest one. And so I'm the most closely removed from my higher ed experience, but also most closely removed from my K-12 experience. In addition, I got two little boys, almost 4 years old, almost 2 years old. And so kindergarten for us is going to be right around the corner. So I'm uniquely interested in making sure that we get public education correctly. What I also like about our legislature this last class is that we have the most tribal member legislators in our history serving. 8 out of 105 enrolled members. There's probably more that legislators too that have some sort of descendancy or ancestry piece there, but um, 8 tribal member legislators, 4 Republican, 4 Democrat, 6 of us in the House, 2 in the Senate. And that just brings a better perspective. That's better for governance in general.
For the 8 Native American legislators serving in South Dakota, state-tribal relations continues to be an issue.
For me, it's been an important subject because I feel like there's so much more we can do. There's more bridges to be built. I had the fortune of working with Senator Round, so I was his state director of tribal affairs and got to work on that federal government, government to government relationship with the tribes. And the state tribal relationship is a little bit more difficult. And part of that is naturally because of jurisdictional challenges, resource challenges, whatever it may be. But I try to remind people, even if it doesn't feel like it and looks like it all the time, we really are heading in the right direction. You go back to Governor Mickelson with his year of reconciliation, with Tim Gallego and the other folks too, a part of that effort. And then you look at the other administration since and the legislature since. We've had the State Tribal Relations Committee in the legislature since the 90s. That still is in operation today. When I interned in 2013, we didn't have very many tribal member legislators then. You didn't see tribal leaders coming to testify or pitch bills. We didn't have a State of the Tribes address like we do the State of the State with the governor, or the State of the Judiciary with the Supreme Court. And so we have those things. And so, again, I feel like we're heading in the right direction.
Last month, State Senator Sean Bordeaux told ICT that tribal leaders were upset with remarks Governor Kristi Noem made regarding Mexican drug cartels coming to the reservations.
I was one of the legislators, me and Representative Perry Pouyer, went and visited with the governor the next morning and got a kind of one-on-one with her and a couple of her advisors, and we were able to just kind of share thoughts, share comments, and really that take away from that. It was a good meeting. It was productive. Really, I mean, I just kind of reminded her and let her know, you have tribal member legislators here, and you have tribal chairmen that this batch of tribal chairmen, tribal leadership, for the most part, they're willing to work together and they want to find ways. And I hear that same thing from her and her team too. So again, I don't think that we're that far apart, but sometimes we let words or we take things out of context on both sides and we blow it up into a bigger thing than it needs to be. And again, that doesn't solve any problems. That's not helping anybody. And so again, my advice to her was, well, lean on us. Let us, as citizen legislators, let us help build bridges too. And communication and consultation is so important. And like I talked to my chairman, and part of that was, geez, if you're going to mention us in your speech, just give me a courtesy heads up. I've identified, I call it like a kind of spokes on the wheel or a healthy community continuum. All communities, what they really need is they need public safety, they need housing, they need access to healthcare, they need quality education for their kids, they need economic opportunity, and they need the infrastructure for all of that. And if any one of those spokes is damaged, you're going to feel it in a community. And unfortunately, a lot of our tribal communities, multiple spokes are broken. And so what can we do to try to get creative and find some of those solutions? And fortunately, there's a lot of people that do care. Again, we have a lot of tribal leaders that sometimes the political scientists in me wish that they weren't, 2-year terms and they have a little bit more time to kind of tackle these issues, because they're dealing with, we have the large land-based tribes up in South Dakota and significant populations and really rural. And so, I mean, those are some key things that we got to figure out. And what can we do to work together? And again, that's why I've always tried to make change from within, whether it was in a federal government role or whether it's in the state government role. What can we do to build partnerships for our people? And I got to give a shout out to some of my colleagues too, including one, probably my favorite legislator. I have to say that, but she really is Representative St. John. She got her Indian Child Welfare Advisory Council bill passed this year. So important, and I think that's a good effort. I had a bill on tribal housing for housing infrastructure last year. We passed a $200 million infrastructure program, and then the tribes were accidentally, unintended consequence, cut out. And so that was something we got sailed through. It was one of the first bills that got to the governor's desk and got signed into law. The tribal flags issue has been an up and down roller coaster for the last 4 or 5 years. And my message to anybody is, we need to get those flags up. We need to get them in the state capitol, because that state capitol is for all of us. And again, when I see those kids and when I get my little boys coming to visit me in the capitol too, I want them to look up and I want them to see their American flag, their South Dakota state flag, and their Sistian-Wahpeton and the Yankton Sioux tribal flag. And that's important for that next generation. And so I'm hoping that eventually people can put the politics aside and that we can do that for the next generation. We need to all have that mindset going forward. And there's a lot of us that feel that way. And so I'm going to just keep trying to get some wins and keep trying to have conversations and see what we can do to do that, because that's important for all of us.
Wooliwin. Wooliwin. Thank you. Woolly is good. So Wooliwin is thank you in a good way.
That is a slice of our Indigenous world. For all of the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.